Good evening. I'm David Levine. I'm very pleased that my guest tonight is Dr. Paul Offit, who's director of the Vaccine Education Center and professor of pediatrics and division of infectious diseases at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. He is a Maurice Hillman professor of vaccinology at the Perelman School of Medicine at the University of Pennsylvania. He may look familiar to you because he's on TV every day on something, CNN or NBC or ABC, quoted in the New York Times, and because he's an internationally recognized expert in the fields of virology, immunology, was a member of the advisory committee on immunization practice for the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. He's also a member of the FDA Administration Vaccines and Related Biological Products Advisory Committee. So, we're here tonight to talk about his new book, which is called You Bet Your Life. And it says, From Blood Transfusions to Mass Vaccination, the Long and Risky History of Medical Innovation. And it's a very readable book. It's read very, very quickly. And so my first question for you, Dr. Offit, is, it's kind of sad what happens to some of these people. I mean, there are researchers who committed suicide. I'm looking at Jonas Salk. What do you talk about him? Who's always thought was a hero, always looked happy, never won the Nobel Prize, never really got the recognition by the scientists that you would think. And you also talk about some of the real disasters that happened with some of the first products. And how terrible some of the researchers felt, now some of the doctors who administered to them not knowing that. And you also talk about how people should make decisions. And you give one analogy saying that if there's a tiger coming, running at you, and someone said, well, there's a rickety old bridge there, you can run over. I don't know if it's going to hold, you're going to do it. But if you're not in danger, if someone says, well, you might want to try this medicine, you're going to say, I don't know. I don't know if I'm going to take that rickety bridge. So, and then you have this quote, which I thought was great. In the final analysis, people should make the most informed, most clear-eyed, most dispassionate decisions using all the information available, knowing that decisions under uncertainty might be the wrong ones. Every choice involves risk, even the simplest one. So, you have so many samples, but why don't we talk about transfusions?
Okay.
And what went wrong? I mean, that you talk about, it's been popularized in songs, and what happened with hemophiliacs. So why don't you give a little history of transfusions and how it wasn't in the first year, it wasn't the magic thing we thought it would be.
Yeah, so the way I've tried to write the book is okay. So would you get this medical innovation now? How about now? So take blood transfusions, for example. It's a perfect example. We began transfusing people with blood back in the 1600s. The source of the blood was barnyard animals. So would you get a transfusion then? I think most people would probably say no. But the fact is, many people, or the handful of people that was at least recorded on, did fairly well. They all had transfusion reactions, obviously, because there was a mismatch in blood types. But they all generally did pretty well after they survived that transfusion reaction. Okay, so now you're in the early 1900s. We have identified A, B, O blood grouping. Okay, would you get a transfusion now? And realize that if you do, we still haven't identified Rh typing yet, right? The O positive, the positive is the Rh factor. Okay, so now we've identified A, B, O blood groups and Rh blood groups. Would you get vaccines now or get a blood transfusion now? Now you're like in the mid 1940s, where you proceed to have hepatitis B, hepatitis C that often contaminate blood transfusion. And there was just a massive sort of killing of American servicemen with a huge contaminated lot with hepatitis B virus. So, okay, so now you can identify hepatitis B. You can identify hepatitis C. Now you're in the late 1970s. Would you get a blood transfusion now? remembering that HIV is just about to enter the blood supply, which will now kill thousands of people, primarily young hemophiliacs who are basically the canary in the coal mine when it comes to blood transfusions. Okay, so now we can identify HIV. We've identified it. And now you're in today. Would you get a blood transfusion today? Remembering that there are viruses we don't know about, and there are viruses we don't test for. So there's always some level of risk. And I think the purpose of writing this book was to get people to realize that that's always true. The original title of the book actually was The Learning Curve. And I think people will say, you know what, let me just wait till the learning curve's over, then I'll get that technology. But first of all, learning curve's never over, and sometimes you can't wait. As you said, sort of when the lion's chasing you, you can't wait. So there's 4,000 people waiting for a heart transplant. 1,300 of them will die while waiting. Do you want to be one of the first to get a pig heart? Which is possible. We just had a pig kidney that was transplanted just in the last couple of weeks. Successful. You can clone pigs so that you're less likely to reject the tissue. Do you want to be one of the first to get those? Do you want to be one of the first to get CRISPR technology if you have sickle cell disease or you have cystic fibrosis, which are single gene diseases? Do you want to be one of the first to try that? Knowing there are things we don't know about that we will learn in time, because that's always true. And I just think I'm trying to sort of set expectations in this book so people will be a little more tolerant of what is the inevitable learning curve.
So something happened in my family that was quite much. So my ex-wife is B negative, and she got a Rogram shot, and then you can explain why she did that to us. And then I get a letter from the company that made it saying that they really weren't checking the blood for AIDS. But don't be alarmed. Why would anyone be alarmed? They're saying because the blood was pasteurized and all these things. So of course we had to go to our doctors and get checked. Luckily, nobody was happening, but that was quite a shakeup because you had such faith in these things, and then you get this little letter saying, "Don't be alarmed." Well, of course you're alarmed, So maybe you can explain why. First of all, why do they have to do this?
Yeah, so if you're Rh negative and you have an Rh positive baby in you waiting to be born, you may make antibodies directed against that child's red blood cells, which could be fatal to the child prior to birth. So the purpose of the Rogam is to sort of block your ability to make those antibodies, basically. That's where Rogam comes from. And in the old days, before Rogam existed, it was illegal actually for somebody who was Rh negative, an Rh negative woman, to marry an Rh positive man because of that possibility.
And how did they enforce that?
I don't know. I assume that blood typing has been around since the early 1900s.
Okay.
But that was true. It was Rogam made it so that now people who are Rh incompatible can marry each other.
So you also say in this, all medical breakthroughs are accompanied by tragedies, and you quote F. Scott Fitzgerald saying, "Show me a hero and I'll show you a tragedy." So Christian Barnard was, world famous for doing the first heart transplant. And as you're right, he's probably the most unlikely person to do it. And I didn't know, and he became a rock star. And I didn't know he would dated Gina Lollobrigida or anything like that. But he became a rock star, and basically he was shunned by the medical community.
It was so he was in South Africa, right. And the laws were a little looser there in terms of how you could declare, for example, brain death, or when you could remove the heart from somebody. So and he was an unlikely person to do that. There were certainly people like Norman Shumway, for example, at Stanford, who were far more experienced and better equipped to have done that heart transplant. But he was the first to do it. He was very aggressive, and he was very much sought media attention, which I think scientists and doctors generally don't like when other scientists and doctors do that. But his first heart transplant, this Louis Washkansky, lived only 18 days, which, given how famous he was, you would have thought that he would have had a little more success. And the reason he died actually was that he had a bacterial pneumonia pneumonia, which Christian Barnard incorrectly diagnosed as rejection. And so he upped the immunosuppressive therapy at a time when he had a bacterial pneumonia, which was the opposite of what he should have done. And so he largely contributed to Washkansky's death, and then he never attended Washkansky's funeral, which really upset Washkansky's wife, Anne. But the minute he did that transplant and it was the first human heart-to-heart transplant. It wasn't the first heart transplant of a human. I mean, baboon hearts had been used to transplant people before that, but it was first human-to-human heart transplant. And he just, was feted by the Pope, by presidents. I mean, and he just loved it and went around the world and just bathed in the glory. But he was really sort of generally a below-average surgeon for the most part.
So now we, tell people to, be cautious and do things. So what do you say to the people who are questioning the COVID vaccine?
Well, it's not, so I'm on the FDA's Vaccine Advisory Committee. And when we approve, I'll give you an example of sort of how this works. So we just approved vaccines for the 5 to 11-year-old, just within the last week or so. And when we did that on a study of 2,400 children, 2-to-1 vaccine to placebo. So 1,600 children got vaccine, 800 got placebo. There were 16 cases of COVID in the placebo group, 3 in the vaccine group, so roughly 91% effective. When that came out, and this was also true for the 12 to 15-year-old, people with the 12 to 15-year-old, that was also a 2,400 child study. There were 18 cases. It was 1-to-1, 1,200 vaccine, 1,200 placebo, 18 cases of COVID, all in the placebo group. When we approved that, I got a lot of hate mail, really angry hate mail from parents that said, really, 2,400 children, that's all you want to study? I mean, for the 5 to 11-year-old, you're making decisions based on 2,400 children for 28 million children. I mean, is that all you want? If the Pfizer vaccine for adults was tested in 40,000 people, why are we only doing 2,400 for children? Shouldn't we do more? And, my response to that was, okay, for the 12 to 15-year-old, we could do, instead of doing 2,400, we could do 24,000. And instead of there being 18 cases of COVID, there would have been 180 cases of COVID. I mean, what price? Knowledge. What human price do you want to pay for knowledge? And where that came up, and it sort of relates to the book, was with the polio vaccine. And just going back to Jonas Salk. Jonas Salk made his vaccine by taking polio virus, growing it up in cell culture, purifying it, killing it with a chemical. What he then did was he tested it in 700 children in the Pittsburgh area, found that it induced a vigorous immune response, it was safe, and he said to his wife Donna that night, "Eureka, I've got it." And then the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis, or March of Dimes, wanted to do a big clinical trial, the biggest clinical trial, really, I think, of any medical product in history, frankly, and that broke his heart. He didn't want to do that trial. He didn't want to give placebo vaccine to children in the United States in the 1950s during the summer, when polio would kill 1,500 children a year and paralyze as many as 30,000. Nonetheless, so that trial was done. 420,000 children got vaccine, 200,000 got placebo. And when it was all over, Thomas Francis, who ran that trial, stood up at the podium at Rackham Hall and said those 3 famous words: safe, potent, effective. I remember this. I'm a first and second grader in the 1950s. My mother cried when that vaccine came out. And that headline, those 3 words were the headline of every newspaper in this country, and church bells rang out, and synagogues held special prayer meetings, and the Voice of America broadcast that to Europe, and department stores stopped while that announcement was made. Well, how did he know it was effective? How did Thomas Francis know that was effective? He knew it was effective because 16 children died in that study of polio, all in the placebo group. He knew that vaccine was effective because 36 children were paralyzed in that study, 34 in the placebo group. I mean, this is in the book, and just was a very emotional moment for me because those were all first and second graders. I mean, I was a first and second grader then. I mean, those children, but for the flip of a coin, could have lived a long and fulfilling life. I mean, what price knowledge? And it comes up to me now. It reminds me now, as we're doing these, basically trying to build the airplane, the COVID vaccine airplane, while it's in the air, as we're doing trials that are definitely smaller than we would normally do for children. But what human price do you want to pay? How many children do you want to have in that placebo group before you feel comfortable? It's always the push and pull here, and there are no risk-free choices. Only choices that take different risks.
Well, I also liked, you quote a lot of interesting people, like, Gore Vidal talked about, they said, is there any area you wouldn't want to live in? He said, I wouldn't want to live in an area where there isn't anesthesia. And but you talk about there are some risks. There are risks of anesthesia, and you talk about chloroform, and there's also some horrible numbers of people who got very sick from some of the anesthesia that was given. So can you talk a little bit about the history of anesthesia?
Yeah, so chloroform, which was developed in Europe, and ended up basically knighting the person who was the inventor, could be fatal. I mean, it could cause a fatal overwhelming reaction that wasn't true with the other two products, which were nitrous oxide and ether. And but it's interesting how Europe tended to use chloroform much longer because it was developed in Europe. Whereas we in the United States didn't. We used ether much longer just because we weren't comfortable with chloroform for that reason. And you sort of see that now, actually. I think, for example, China has its inactivated vaccine. Russia has its vectored virus vaccine. We have our Moderna vaccine. It's a US product. In fact, the Trump administration, when they basically paid for that product, paid for the mass production, paid for all the original research, at least the sort of phase 1, 2, 3 trials, had as a deal that Moderna really couldn't distribute that vaccine anywhere else but in the United States. I mean, which I think was a deal Moderna should have never signed, but in any case did. And but you see that sort of nationalism that's currently with the vaccines was also the nationalism of that. Of those things. I don't know if any of your listeners ever saw the short-lived 2-year Showtime series called The Nick, which was about a fictional New York City hospital in the early 1900s, 1906. And they did anesthesia there. And what I loved about that show is it was absolutely accurate. I mean, they were really good, true to the medicine. But at one point you see a patient is under ether anesthesia. One of the surgeons is cauterizing the wound and then catches on fire. The surgeon catches on fire, completely on fire, and then sort of staggers back and ultimately dies. And you watch that scene and you think, my God, I mean, how low are these producers going to try and sell this show? But that happened. I mean, that's why it is ultimately that we stopped using ether. It was because it is highly flammable. And really, of the 3 original, obviously now we have the fluorines and stuff. I mean, we have anesthetics that are not any of those. But nitrous oxide, interestingly, which was the first anesthetic, is the one that still survives to some extent in dentist offices.
And I remember the first person who had it, when they tried it, he just said, "Here, put this on me and just take my teeth out." Basically, and he seemed to like. I know someone who insists on having nitrous oxide when they go to the dentist.
That's interesting.
Even for a teeth cleaning. So it was. You also talk about Babe Ruth in the history of medicine. What was his? I never think of Babe Ruth in the history of medicine, but he was.
Don't. Yeah, that surprised me. I mean, there was a number of discoveries for me in the writing of this book, but Sidney Farber, who's the person for the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute, that's the Farber of the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute. I mean, probably one of the world's greatest of the sort of pathologists and cancer chemotherapists. But he had the mistaken notion actually that folic acid, or what he thought was folic acid, had an anti-neoplastic activity, and treated about 11 children who had acute lymphoblastic leukemia, what ended up being a growth promoting factor that ended up hastening the deaths of children, frankly, who rarely lived a year anyway. It's really hard to take children back then in the 1940s who were going to die quickly anyway and make them worse, but he was able to do that with folic acid. Then he realized actually that it was the opposite of what he needed to do. He needed a folic acid antagonist, which was then originally called aminopterin. Now the methotrexate is the equivalent. But one of the first to receive that sort of the first person to receive that folic acid antagonist as an adult with cancer was Babe Ruth. And he did that because he thought it would help. He didn't have any illusions that this would save his life, but he felt that it would at least contribute to the body of knowledge, and it said that. So yeah, I never thought of Babe Ruth that way either. But he was the first adult who received cancer chemotherapy.
And you also talk about Charlie Chaplin and the paternity test.
Right.
So that's it. Why don't you tell that story? That's a great story.
Yeah, so at a time when blood typing had been pretty much set, the where we knew about A, B, O blood typing, even RH blood typing, it was very easy to tell paternity, but it just took a while for the courts to agree to do that. I mean, to legislate that essentially. And so, Charlie Chaplin who was married but had a girlfriend, and his girlfriend became pregnant, and he insisted it wasn't his child. And then paternity test was done using blood typing to show it couldn't have possibly been his child. But nonetheless, the courts refused to acknowledge that, and he had to pay child support for the rest of that child's at least young life. And so it was an example of sort of denying the science.
He was also hounded out of the United States because of his lack of morals and stuff. Yeah, but that's also true in. I went to a seminar at the World Science Festival, and they talked about, the real science behind investigation. They said that, when a person said, "This is the person that tried to rape me," or "This is a person that murdered my father, I saw it," that over trumps DNA evidence, it over trumps forensic evidence, any evidence you can, because the jurors believe that person, with such certainty. So it still goes on today, these things. So, I mean, so, talk about, let's talk about, some of the things about, so gene therapy is, relatively new. People are very excited about it. They're very excited about CRISPR, but we don't have 100 years of experience with these therapies. And what are some of the risks of gene therapy?
Well, we'll learn as we go, won't we? I think I'm at the University of Pennsylvania, so I witnessed the death of Jesse Gelsinger. And I think that the title of the New York Times article was the biomedical death of Jesse Gelsinger. So here was a 19-year-old young man, who had an ornithine transcarbamylase deficiency, which meant that he would have a buildup of ammonia, essentially, no different than the ammonia that you would use to scrub floors with, in his bloodstream, which would occasionally cause him to lapse into a coma and have to go to the hospital. In order to avoid that, he had a very strict dietary regimen that included taking as many as 20 pills a day, which for a teenager was really hard. And so when he was 19, he signed up for Jim Wilson's gene therapy program at the University of Pennsylvania. And Jim, to his credit, Dr. Wilson, to his credit, went very slowly, sort of increasing the amount of this sort of virus vector over time. So what the virus vector he used was essentially a replication defective adenovirus. So adenoviruses are common cold viruses, among other things. You can render them replication defective just by taking out the so-called E1 gene or E3 gene or both. And it's essentially the same way that we make the Johnson & Johnson vaccine or the AstraZeneca vaccine or the Russian vaccines. They were all replication defective adenoviruses. However, the quantity of virus that Jesse Gelsinger got was probably 300 times what you get if you're getting these vaccine viruses, which tells you how much you were getting, because when you get these vaccine viruses, you're getting about 50 billion virus particles, and this was 300 times that. So Jim Wilson, who was the head of that gene therapy program, gradually worked his way up, and there was a young woman who had gotten the same vector that Jesse Gelsinger had gotten without a problem. But then Jesse Gelsinger got it, and he developed a high fever, low blood pressure. He was acting as if he was in septic shock, and he was overwhelmed. They put him on face mask oxygen, then a ventilator, then an oscillator, then a heart lung machine, and eventually he succumbed. And nobody could figure out why. But Jim Wilson, to his credit, was able to figure out that what had happened was there had been this massive oversecretion of an immunological moderator called interleukin-6. That's what had killed him. Even if he'd known it at the time, there's nothing he would have been able to do about it, because we didn't have a monoclonal antibody directed against interleukin-6. But that was a key finding, because what happened then years later, we tried to legislate this away. With his death, we tried to put in place a variety of of rules to make it impossible for that sort of thing to happen again. Of course, it happened again because there's no way you can legislate away the learning curve. But what happened was there was a 5-year-old girl who had acute lymphoblastic leukemia. She received CAR T therapy, chimeric antigen receptor T therapy, where they take her T cells out, re-engineer them so that they would then be directed at killing so-called cytotoxic T cells, killing her leukemia cells. And that's what they did. They infused that. She too then started to get a high fever. And because this, the University of Pennsylvania, Children's Hospital of Philadelphia are all right there next to each other. And as she had that reaction, one of the doctors taking care of her said, this is just like Jessie Gelsinger from years ago. This is the same story. So they measured her interleukin 6, found that it was sky high. Now you had a drug, tocilizumab, which was recommended actually for children who had juvenile rheumatoid arthritis. So it wasn't for this particular indication, but he gave her that and saved her life. And now a large percentage of people who get that CAR T therapy have to get this so-called tocilizumab to make sure that they can handle that CAR T therapy. So the point being that if you go to Penn now or you go to CHOP now, you see Emily Whitehead's picture everywhere. I mean, she was on the Today Show. She went to visit President Obama because we're very comfortable celebrating our successes. But that success would never have happened without the failure of Jessie Gelsinger. So we're comfortable recognizing the successes, but not the failures. And that, I think, people need to realize that the only way you advance is with the failures. I mean, look at the early heart transplants, the early kidney transplants. They were brutal in terms of all the things we needed to learn. But that's the only way to learn. You can't start at the end, sadly.
Yeah, I mean, you quote all kinds of people saying that, there's always going to be tragedies in the history of medicine. And there's also going to be people not recognized. There's also going to be researchers just feeling they blame themselves for making, even though there was no way they could have known, but it was very inspiring to read how much these scientists and researchers really felt terribly that that something they did caused harm and it was nothing they could have foreseen. So we talk about all kinds of. So I thought also the politics of brain death is very interesting because of what's going on in Texas and abortions and all these things, and that was a very big battle back then as to when you could transplant a heart. When was a person really brain dead? And has the Supreme Court actually, has that been established yet?
I think so. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a group out of Harvard actually that came up with criteria for what was considered brain death, and with that allowed for heart transplants really to take off, because otherwise you just had to wait for the heart to stop beating. And obviously there's invariably damage associated with that, so that you could take a functional beating heart out of someone who was now brain dead, made for a lot of heart transplants. But the heart transplant story is interesting because it's when Christian Barnard did his heart transplant, it became sort of heart transplant mania. I mean, 100 countries set up heart transplant units. And then what happened over time, when we could sort of never get people to live really much past a year or two, the number of heart transplant units really gradually dwindled until there was a head of sort of a cover on Time magazine that said it was something like, "Whatever happened to heart transplants?" Until we could learn a couple of important things. The most important thing was cyclosporin, having inventing an immunosuppressive agent that was much more specific for the kind of cells that are associated with immunological rejection, so that you can still, you wouldn't dramatically lessen your body's ability to fight infection. That was a major advance, as was the ability to detect early rejection using the so-called bioptome, to take a small piece of the heart, so you could figure out that the early rejection was going on. And when that happened, now you have your sort of routine sort of heart transplants, patients living 15 years. But it took a while to do that, and a lot of people who gave their lives to understanding that. But that was actually the whole thing about the rickety bridge, was that was Christian Barnard. He said, that you You wouldn't swim across a river that had alligators in it unless a lion was chasing you. And Louis Washkansky, the first heart transplant, was really on the verge of death. And so a lion was chasing him. That's why he chose that transplant.
His wife was furious. Christian okay. Didn't come to the funeral. Now you talk about, I think it's antibiotics and sulfonamides killed people, and you said that the FDA was as inefficiently armed as a hunter pursuing a tiger with a flying swatter. And you are a little critical of the FDA at times.
Well, the FDA was toothless. Unfortunately, I mean, I'm on the FDA advisory committee now, vaccine advisory committee, so I'm not critical of the FDA so much anymore, with the exception of during the Trump administration, when they sort of got their arm twisted and through emergency use authorization approved hydroxychloroquine, even though it hadn't been shown to work or either to treat or prevent COVID, and they approved convalescent plasma with very little data that it worked. That bothered me. But no, I think we need the FDA. And I think when people don't trust the FDA now, we're in trouble. If we're in a country that doesn't trust the FDA, we're in trouble. But the FDA is that they're the ones who stand between the American public and the pharmaceutical industry to make sure that we get products that are safe and effective. But I think what happened here was with the elixir sulfanilamide disaster. So sulfanilamide, the first broad spectrum antibiotic, the first antibiotic we had to treat bacterial pneumonia, treat bacterial meningitis, treat gonorrhea, et cetera, was a product of the German dye industry in the mid 1930s. And that became a product around 1936, 1937. And the companies that made it in the United States made it in tablet form, powder form. But one company, the Massengill Company of Bristol, Tennessee, wanted to make it more palatable for children, so that it could be an oral medicine, a liquid. And so what they did was they resuspended sulfanilamide in diethylene glycol, which was toxic to kidneys and was known, frankly, to be toxic to kidneys. It was known to be toxic to kidneys from papers that had been published in experimental animals as much as 6 and 7 years earlier. But nonetheless, the scientist, the lead scientist at the Massengill Company presumably didn't know about those studies. So about 240 gallons of elixir sulfanilamide was released, and it started to kill people. It killed about 100 people, 34 of whom were children, before it was realized that this was a problem, and they then withdrew the rest of that drug. Had all 240 gallons been consumed, it would have killed 4,000 people, roughly. And so, the FDA had asked for that drug to be withdrawn, but they had to ask. I mean, they couldn't force the withdrawal. The company had to agree to withdraw it. They didn't legally have to withdraw it. And then when the company was found to have been, basically negligent in producing this product, they paid a very small fine, actually, to the scheme. I think the company did fine. The person who was the CEO did fine. There was really little they could do, but the next year that gave birth to the 1938 Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act, which at least started to begin to give teeth to the FDA to do what they could need to do. It's funny, the CEO of the Massengill Company said, we did nothing legally wrong. And he didn't. I mean, you didn't really have to test the products for safety. You didn't really even have to test that they worked. It was the Wild West of American medicine then. But now we're better. But it's as Michael Harris, who's an historian, has said, the history of drug regulation is built on tombstones, and that was certainly true there.
I remember when Dr. David Kessler became head of the FDA, one of the first things he did was to seize Minute Maid orange juice, because they said it was 100% real orange juice and it was really made of frozen concentrate. So I guess he wanted to show the powers of the FDA. I mean, if you look at the chart of the US government, the FDA is like, here's the HHS, the FDA is way down there, but it's got a lot of power. And it is interesting. So if you have questions for Dr. Offit, and he said he will take questions on the vaccines, because this is what he does every day for the last year and a half. Please put them in the Q&A box and I'll get to them. So I have 1 or 2 questions that came before, when people registered. So someone says, what do you recommend to those of us in the Novavax and AstraZeneca SARS-CoV-2 vaccine trials do now that travel is opening up and our vaccines still have not been approved in the US, EU, or given World Health Organization, EUL? Should I drop out of the trial to receive an approved vaccine? Which one? Continue to wait? U.S. trial coordinators have no real advice. So,
I mean, if you want to know that you're vaccinated, then don't be, I guess, in a placebo-controlled trial. I mean, I guess my question to the questioner would be, are they in placebo-controlled trials, or I
this
presume,
person actually called me and she said she wasn't a placebo trial at first, but then she was switched over. So she's fully vaccinated.
and she's fully vaccinated with a non-WHO recognized vaccine.
Novavax.
Right. So Novavax is not there yet. So it's a purified protein, adjuvanted purified protein vaccine, which looks good. I mean, the data certainly looks good, but not approved yet. Certainly, it's not approved yet in the United States. But I think that Novavax is certainly interested in submitting for data to licensure. But I mean, I guess my what to say if you want to travel, but you've received a non-WHO recognized vaccine, which generally means that you're not going to be able to travel. I think there's no downside to getting, say, 2 doses of an mRNA containing vaccine or 1 dose of J&J's vaccine. I mean, in either case, in all those cases, there'll be a booster response. The one thing that was at our last FDA Vaccine Advisory Committee meeting, there was a presentation by Kristen Light from the University of Maryland, where she did basically all 9 cells, meaning Moderna, Pfizer, J&J, and all possible 9 combinations to show that everything boosted, that everything boosted, the independent of what vaccine you got before. If you got a different vaccine, everything works. So I think that she probably should have to boost with a different vaccine if she's wants to be travel with a recognized vaccine.
I have a friend in France coming over next week, and he says, how will I get to a New York City restaurant? All I have is the France. He got all this dose of Pfizer in France. And I said, I don't know.
Well, that counts. I mean, if you got Pfizer's vaccine, that's an internationally recognized vaccine.
But it's a French certificate, so it's, who knows, you know. So someone recommend, do you recommend COVID-19 vaccine boosters? What about for children? Are there any concerns for fertility issues for girls? Should one mix and match? This is a million questions. Should one mix and match vaccines such as with Pfizer, and it can also, and can it be done with J&J?
Right, okay, so wait, fertility was one question, mix and match was another.
It's in the chat. If you look over the chat, you can see it.
Yeah, I don't see. I just see the Novavax one.
Okay.
Unless it's in Q&A. Is it in Q&A?
I'll paste it and put it in Q&A.
But read the first part of the question. I'll answer all the questions that were there. What was the first part of that question?
First, do you recommend the vaccination of boosters? I'm sure you do.
Okay, boosters. Fine. Okay, so I can answer. So the booster story has become a big story today because Pfizer is now submitting to the FDA for basically booster dosing for anyone over 18, period. I mean, that's what they're looking for. Here's what I would say. I think that if you are over 65 years of age, you clearly benefit from a 3rd dose of vaccine. I mean, they're both data in Israel, data in the United States clearly show that, meaning you are less likely to have serious illness if you've gotten 3 doses of an mRNA containing vaccine than 2 doses, and with the 3rd dose being 6 months after the last dose. Clearly true. That's it. I mean, if you talk about clear data that 3rd dose matters, that's it. Now, the recommendation also from the CDC is that if you're over 50 and have a medical condition that puts you at high risk of severe COVID, that is a recommendation. And that's it. The other recommendations for people over 18 who have high risk medical conditions, or people over 18 who live or work in an occupation where they're at high risk of exposure, those are sort of should be considered recommendations. It's not a firm recommendation. Like, you could do it if you want. But I think for the over 65-year-old, you clearly should get a booster. What's happened, I think, sadly, is that when President Biden stood up in August 18th and said, as of September 20th, a month from now, we're going to have boosters for everybody over 16, he basically sent the incorrect message out there that 2 doses was not enough to protect you against serious disease. And that's not true. At least up to the present time, 2 doses does appear to protect you well against serious disease, including for Delta, except for older patients, much older patients. Okay, in terms of mixing and matching, sure, I think that everything seems to work. So if you've gotten Pfizer and you want to get a Moderna boost, or the other way around, I think Johnson & Johnson's always been a 2-dose vaccine. I think the company, had this not been a pandemic, would have launched this as a 2-dose product, because they were almost done their 2-dose trial when they submitted for approval for 1 dose. So I think that's a 2-dose vaccine. In terms of fertility, okay, so fertility issue, which is the most common question I get, even by parents of 5 to 11-year-olds, is this. There were two researchers who submitted a letter to the European Medicines Agency claiming that the gene sequence that determined the SARS-CoV-2 spike protein was virtually identical to the gene sequence that coded for syncytin-1, which is a protein that sits on the surface of placental cells and is important for placental cell health. So therefore, if you make an immune response to SARS-CoV-2 spike protein, which is what you're doing when you get these vaccines, you're also going to be inadvertently making an immune response to your own placenta, therefore decreasing fertility. So first of all, that was wrong. I mean, to say that those two genetic sequences are similar is saying like you and I have the same Social Security number because they both contain the number 5. So that's wrong. Secondly, is that there were 36 instances of pregnancy during the mRNA vaccine trials. And if it was true then that the vaccine decreased fertility, then most, if not all of those instances of pregnancy should have been in the placebo group, but they weren't. They were equally divided. Thirdly, if you're claiming that making an antibody response against SARS-CoV-2 spike protein is also making an immune response against your own placenta, remember more than 100 million people have been infected with this virus in this country over the last year and a half. So what's happened to the birth rate? The birth rate in theory should have come tumbling down if that hypothesis was correct, but it hasn't. It stayed the same. So these vaccines do not affect fertility. It's painful to watch how people, once they have this in their head, it cannot go away. It's like, it's impossible to unring the bell. It's very easy to scare people, I've learned. It's very hard to unscare them. No matter how much good data you have, it just doesn't go away. I mean, it's like the razor blade and the candy apple, right? I mean, I don't know if you remember that in the 70s, that sort of that story circulated. You know, child goes to a house, you don't know who the parents are, you get the candy apple, child bites into the candy apple, razor blade in the candy apple. Never happened. Complete urban myth. Utter nonsense, right? But nonetheless, I think if your child goes trick-or-treating, gets a candy apple from a house you don't know, you've got that image in your head and it never goes away.
Okay, so I think you answered all the questions there. Let me see. It's here. As journalists, how can we better combat the misinformation that the vaccines don't work because there are breakthrough infections? How to get the message across that vaccines prevent the vast majority of transmission and hospitalizations, death, and therefore vaccination of more people is still quite important for slowing and ultimately stopping the pandemic.
Man, you are a person out of my own heart. Yes, I agree. I think the worst communication error that we have had with this vaccine is that one. Labeling a mild or asymptomatic infection in someone who is vaccinated as a breakthrough infection was a terrible idea because the term breakthrough implies failure, and that's not a failure. When Brett Kavanaugh, who's fully vaccinated, gets an asymptomatic infection, if you listen to the way that's carried on the news, you'd have thought he was in the ICU, the way they carried it. He won. Vaccinated, exposed to the virus, it's reproducing in his upper respiratory tract, but not causing symptoms. That's a win in the world of vaccines. And that came actually from that outbreak in Provincetown in eastern Massachusetts, when thousands of men get together, celebrate July 4th. About 80% of them are vaccinated, right? Nonetheless, there's an outbreak. There's 346 cases of COVID in people who were previously vaccinated. Most are mild or asymptomatic. That was the birth of the term breakthrough infection. I don't know whose idea that was, but it was a terrible one. And the number of people who were hospitalized among those 346 were 4. So 1.2% of people who were vaccinated but nonetheless infected were hospitalized. That's great. That's a win. That's what you want from a vaccine. I don't know what people expect from these vaccines. That's as good as it gets, but that was a terrible communication error. The other error that came out of that outbreak, and I blame the CDC for this, was when they said that you're just as likely to shed just as much virus if you have a mild infection and were previously vaccinated, or if you have a mild infection and weren't previously vaccinated. That's not true. I mean, studies in Singapore have clearly shown that's not true. You shed less virus for a lesser period of time if you're previously vaccinated. So I don't understand all these booster dosings. I don't. I mean, I think Rochelle Walensky said it best. We're not going to boost our way out of this pandemic. We need to vaccinate the unvaccinated, not boost the vaccinated. And I only hope that our this issue now with all boosters for everybody over 18, I hope that comes to the advisory committees, because I think we have to have that discussion. And part of that discussion has to be, is this really where we want these vaccines to go? Because we're much better off, frankly, distributing them to the world where this virus is still circulating, still creating mutations, still creating variants of concern. Would do far better there than giving a third dose to healthy people here.
So in your book, you point out that vaccines are improved on. I mean, the first shingles vaccine was about 50% effective. Then the doctor said, you need a shingles vaccine. I said, hey, I said, no, that's the old one you had, I gave you. You need the new one, which is 2 parts. So there's a newer vaccine, which is more effective. And I think also is there an HPV vaccine that's better now?
Yeah, well, so yes, so the shingles vaccine, the original shingles vaccine, Zostavax, was about 75% effective at preventing post-herpetic neuralgia. The current vaccine, Shingrix, is much better than that, and so the CDC has appropriately moved from one to the other. The HPV vaccine has a higher valency. So the original vaccine had 4 different HPV serotypes. The current vaccine has 9. So obviously one replaced the other.
And is that also a 3-dose vaccine?
Depends on the age. It's either a 2 or 3 dose vaccine, depending on your age. Younger people, it's 2-dose vaccine.
I mean, I think that is a problem with vaccines, because a lot of times people may not go back and get the next dose.
True.
I mean, was that a selling point for Johnson & Johnson? You get one, they said one and done,
Yes, that's right. That was their hook. Their hook was 1 dose for people who are, for example, scared of shots, or people who are transient and are not going to be in the same place, a couple months later, or a couple weeks later, or people who are homeless, et cetera. So there was an advantage. So there was that was a good 1-dose vaccine. I mean, I think it definitely induced immunological memory. I think it protected against severe disease, but I do think Johnson & Johnson's vaccine in the end is a 2-dose product.
Yeah, my niece was visiting from Canada, and her father-in-law is a doctor, and he said, before you go back, I'm giving you the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, because at the time, Canada wasn't giving out any vaccines. So he said, I just want you to have at least this.
Smart.
Yeah, I guess so. So another question, is there any evidence beyond anecdotal that the COVID vaccine affects the menstrual cycle?
No, none. It's starting to be studied. There's obviously there are a number of factors that can affect menstruation, including stress. But there's no reason to believe it would be a problem. To date, there is no good evidence that it is a problem, other than it's sort of one of those things that circulates.
Okay. And someone had a question about Massengill. Is this the same Massengill of douche fame?
That's right. Feminine hygiene products. That's correct. Massengill, known for feminine hygiene products, and killing about 100 people with elixir sulfonilamide.
Okay. So when you were writing this book, did you have any fear that, putting doubts about some of the terrible things that went wrong would make people say, well, maybe the COVID vaccine people aren't as smart as I thought, but did you have any fears like that? People
naively, I sort of had hope for the opposite. I hope to try and create what are reasonable expectations, with the point being that no matter how far advanced we are, there's always a learning curve. After the Jesse Gelsinger tragedy, there were all these sort of regulations put in place to try and prevent it ever happening again, but it did happen again. I mean, there were French researchers that used a retrovirus vector, which has the advantage, unlike the replication defective adenoviruses, of directly inserting itself into DNA. The problem was, in the 10 children roughly that got that retrovirus vector, it inserted itself right in front of a gene that increased your risk of acute lymphoblastic leukemia, and 4 of those children, 4 of the 10, developed leukemia, despite all the regulations that are in place. So my goal was to try and get to reset expectations for people to realize that this always happens. This is expected to happen, and you just hope you don't have to pay too high of a price. I mean, for me, the being on the FDA Vaccine Advisory Committee, it was a little uncomfortable for me at the beginning when the companies, for example, would do phase 1 trials of 15 people, 20 people, 25 people, and then talk about their ability to make tens of millions of doses. Hey, go a little slower. Be humble, because this process is humbling. I mean, so for example, I would have never predicted that mRNA vaccines would cause myocarditis, albeit rarely, or that these replication defective adenovirus vaccines would be rare causes of clotting, including severe clotting. includes occasionally fatal clotting. I mean, a handful of people, primarily women, have died of blood clots in the brain because of the J&J vaccine. I mean, it's rare. It's like 1 in 500,000, but it's real. And that's always true. There's any medical product that has a positive effect will have a negative effect. If it doesn't have any negative effect, it probably never had a positive effect. Hence homeopathy. Homeopathy doesn't have a negative effect. That's the good news. Water generally doesn't have a negative effect, but also doesn't have a positive effect, other than the placebo response, which is not trivial. I think there is a physiology to placebo medicine, but it is placebo medicine.
Okay. So where can people get your book?
Well, it's available on Amazon and bookstores, so you can, it's not hidden. Actually, it was reviewed today in the Wall Street Journal. It was reviewed a couple of weeks ago in the New York Times Sunday Book Review. So it's actually had some good reviews. Reviewed in Nature, for those of you that get Nature. So it's fortunately kindly so far.
Yeah, the Nature reviewer said Dr. Offit's latest book couldn't be more timely. Using the stories of key patients, he weaves a narrative of incredible transformations in medical care that were not easy or safe linear progressions. Charting some of the great advances, in quotes, Dr. Offit focuses on the long history of mistakes, negligence, paternalism, lack of oversight, and the many casualties along the way, including individuals and public confidence. The book breaks down key developments into 3 parts, traversing a wide range of medical breakthroughs, heart transplants and anesthesia risk, antibiotics and X-ray with oversight, and finally chemotherapy and gene therapy, which is serendipity. So, I mean, before we, came on the air, I was talking to Dr. Offit, and I said it's a very readable book. And there's just some great, fascinating human stories that that you'll. So I think I really recommend this book to everyone. So we have some upcoming interviews with other authors. November 17th, we're doing this book, How to Raise Kids Who Aren't Assholes, the Science-Based Strategies for Better Parenting from Tots to Teens. It's by Melinda Wenner-Moyer. And that will be November 17th. This book just came out. It's by Brendan Borrow. It's called The Epic Rivalries and Heroic Science Behind the Race to the Coronavirus Vaccine, The First Shot. It's called The First Shots. And that will be on December 4th. And we have several other interviews coming up. So I'll be reading a lot of books. So Dr. Offit, you said before, you're ready for the virus to be over. So everyone, asks this. Actually, one more question: do you see any role for the insurance industry in assuming the risks of experimental drugs, i.e., taking premiums to agree to compensate participants who are injured?
Yeah, I mean that's not something I would know a lot about, but I think that's a reasonable thought. Sure, I think that's a reasonable thought. Sure.
So, given where we are today. I know Dr. Fauci speaks about, maybe next spring, this will be over. What has to happen for the virus to be over?
I think we have to achieve a level of population immunity that's probably in the mid 90% range. I mean, right now we're getting there. I mean, we have, if you look at the population immunity induced either by natural infection or vaccination or both, because those aren't necessarily 2 separate groups, you're probably at a solid 80 to 85% now. So I think if you can vaccinate another 30 million people, I really do think we will have a dramatic slowing in the spread of this virus. And it's not going to go away. I think ultimately it will be endemic at some level, but we'll get to the point where it's the level of hospitalization and death will be something we'll consider that we can live with, and we will go about our normal lives. I think Dr. Fauci may well be right. That may be by next spring. See what happens this winter. If we don't get a bump this winter, meaning December, January, early February, if we don't get a bump, that is a really good sign, because this is at its heart a winter virus. And if it doesn't bump this winter, that's a good sign. I think it will bump somewhat. We'll see.
Now, first of all, what does it mean by population?
So the percentage of the population that needs to be immune in order for the virus for the spread of the virus to significantly slow. But you can count either. You can count either vaccination or natural infection as inducing an immune response which will be protective against serious illness. Both do that.
Okay. Now, what about worldwide? Because the vaccination rates worldwide, it's still in the United States, it's not that high either. I mean, where you think it'd be. It's like,
Yeah, I think we're going to need to have a highly vaccinated population for years, if not decades. I mean, the fact is we still vaccinate children in this country against polio. We haven't had polio in this country since the 1970s. We do it because polio still exists in the world. And I think this virus is going to be existing in the world for a while. So I think all the more reason to make sure we get vaccines into the developing world, which is not an altruistic act. It helps us too, but we haven't, and we've done that to some extent. I think we can do it even more.
so also, I think the CDC says that people who are immunocompromised should get vaccinated with a fourth booster shot, or a fourth shot, second booster shot.
It really depends on the term immune compromise is a broad term. There some people are more immunocompromised than the others, and it really has to be individualized to what the level of your immune competence is, whether solid organ transplant, bone marrow transplant, receiving biologicals for rheumatoid arthritis, receiving chemotherapy for cancers. The term immunocompromised is a broad one, and I think therefore the recommendations can't easily be broad.
But do you foresee that come January, if people got their booster shot in August, they're going to be like lining up to get a fourth booster shot?
I think people who've already gotten 2 doses are probably willing to get 10 more doses. That's not what worries me. What worries me is getting people who haven't gotten vaccinated. That's what has to happen. And
I know someone who got 2 Pfizer and 2 Moderna. I said, how'd you do that? He said, I lied. And I said, well, why'd you do that? He said, well, I want to be protected. I said, you are.
you can get them to get 10 doses.
Yeah, so anyways, I want to thank Dr. Offit for spending some time with us. I know you're a busy guy, and as you said, you haven't really been moving off that chair. So do you plan any travel?
You mean getting off the chair and traveling somewhere else? Is that what you mean, like downstairs? No, I'm planning no. Well, no, I'm going to go visit my in-laws around Thanksgiving. So drive down there.
Okay, and so also, I mean, are you? More and more people are asking me, should, and I say, well, they're doing indoor dining because it's getting colder. Is that something you think is okay? I mean, in New York City, in New York City, you have to be vaccinated to do indoor dining.
So I'm right now in southern New Jersey right now, and we've gone out to dinner. I mean, I wear a mask when I walk in. I wear a mask until I sit down. When I sit down, I take off my mask, but I need to feel comfortable that I'm at least 4 feet away from another table, and I need to feel comfortable that the person who's serving me is wearing a mask. So I'll do it in that situation.
So do you bring a measuring tape, or is it just
I eyeball it?
Yeah, eyeball it. Okay, so you've loosened up a little bit. That's good to know. All right. Anyway, Dr. Offit, as always, is the third time you've been with us. I know you're busy. It's a pleasure. And next week we're going to be discussing November 17th, how not to raise kids who are assholes. So I'm looking forward to that. And you of course, are welcome to join us too.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.